Welcome to this session, Practical Tips for Implementing Orton-Gillingham in the Classroom. My name is Candy Sellers, and I'm accredited training fellow with Orton-Gillingham Academy and a Calc QI with Alta. Now, this session is a little bit different than what I typically provide, but it's one that I get a lot of questions about. And so I wanted to share a few tips and tricks that I found to organize all of my teaching materials, all of my student materials, and just general suggestions for implementation at the small group, one-on-one, and classroom level. So teaching with the Orton-Gillingham approach, if you're not familiar with it, does require what we call structured flexibility. And that means there is a structure to it, but we also want to be very flexible in our thinking. And that includes planning and organizing as well. Procedures have to be adapted to meet the needs of each individual student or group or classroom, depending on your setting. And I feel like this applies at home, being a parent of a neurodivergent learner myself. So our objectives today are to discuss ways to assemble your teaching and student materials. I also want to offer suggestions for ways that materials can be used as introductory materials or as review materials in either way, in either setting, small group, one-on-one, and even at home. I want to offer suggestions for ways that you could apply it one-on-one, small group, or classroom. My background is in the classroom. I've taught in public, private, and independent settings. I'm also a homeschool parent, and so I've implemented these types of strategies and routines in my learning with my students, with my children at home. And I also want to support you in feeling prepared and organized so that you can give the best instruction possible. So you recently took some Orton-Gillingham coursework or structured literacy coursework, or you're beginning to explore teaching with your own child or homeschooling, or you're just a classroom teacher or independent tutor who wants to learn more. So what do we do now? What do we do with all of these materials? I always joke with my classes that if I gave them, once they're a little bit into their OG journey and once they're a little bit into their teaching journey, especially classroom teacher, if you give them some index cards, a 3-ring binder, some highlighters and Sharpies, I'll even throw in flare pens because I love flare pens, then we all get excited, right? But then you get all of those on one table, and what do we do with them? So here's a suggestion that I have. Number one, you have to find systems for your teaching materials because that's going to be where you start. It's going to have your assessment materials. It's going to have your lesson planning materials. It's going to have all of these wonderful resources that you have from our wonderful community, the resources that you make and share with others and that you want to use, the materials that you make your students use. And so we want those teaching materials readily available so that implementation and planning is streamlined. The next thing you have to do is find a system for your student materials. Once you get into those lessons, once you get into the classroom, once you get into home learning, what do we do with all these student materials? How do we organize them? So we'll talk about a few suggestions for that. You're also going to want to organize your space. Now, whether that is a local space, if your students come to you, or if you're on the move. I have tutored in libraries. I have tutored in my own home office. I've even tutored in a grocery store. And let me tell you, a grocery store is not a bad place to do some tutoring. We tutored in the deli, the front deli, so it was nice, lots of bright windows. It was a nice, quiet space. No one bothered you. No one was really there. And there was the gift of snacks. So there's lots of places that you can tutor, but either way, you want to be prepared and have everything you need so that you're ready to go. So whether it's a traveling tutor, or they come to you, or you're in the classroom, or you're learning at home, how can we organize that space to be most effective? And then the last thing, you're going to have to be willing to adjust and throw it out as needed. I say oftentimes that I have systems that work for a season or work for a particular class or work for a particular student, but they might not work with others. And the timing might be off and you might get tired of one system. So don't think that because you need to move on to another system that that's a failure. It really is growth. It's really being flexible. Remember that flexibility we talked about at the beginning? We want to make sure that we can be flexible and adjust as needed. So just keep that in mind. We have some great systems, but if we need to adjust, that's a good thing. And we can make those adjustments with hopefully some of the suggestions we're going to talk about today. So one of my favorite resources is Multisensory Teaching of Basic Language Skills. And this is a quote from that book. Taking the time to organize the teaching space allows the teachers to remove potential obstacles that could prevent students from becoming learning experts. When I do practicum evaluations and when I watch classrooms and when I'm, in the middle of my own lessons, whether that's classroom or small group or one-on-one, one of the biggest obstacles that we come into is when we're disorganized, when our materials aren't ready. It causes those unnecessary pauses. It causes the student to get off track. It makes us feel a little bit flustered. So it's not that we have to be perfect. We just need to be well planned. We need to be a little bit organized. And frankly, that's hard to do when you're first starting off with all of these classroom materials, when all of these materials at home that you want to use with your own children, and with all of your OG materials. You have tons of card decks and worksheets and reading passages and folders and note cards. And so what do we do with those? We want to make sure that we have systems in place so that they aren't obstacles and we can get to the good stuff, the truly direct, explicit, and systematic instruction for our students so that our learners have everything they need to be ready to go. So in this session, I'm going to offer some suggestions for card decks, for teacher notebook and assessment notebooks, for student notebooks or new learning notebooks. I call them books of knowledge, and you'll see that here in a bit. For irregular words, for handwriting, I'm going to offer some other tools and notebooks that I include in some of the work that I do with students. And then what do we do with all those decodable passages? So the first thing we want to start with is a card deck. What do we do with all of those cards? And card decks come in various shapes and sizes. So I would say it is not beyond me to go into our local box store, our office supply store with a new card deck, and I'm trying them in each one of the boxes to see if they fit, or I'm trying them in different sleeves to see if they fit. So take that and do that with you. I am well known for not exactly reading the description on Amazon. So when something gets to my house and it's not exactly the right size, my family is never surprised. So if you need to, take it in and try it out, because it really is going to be dependent on your card deck size. Generally, these suggestions would fit most card decks. So one of my favorite ways to store a card deck, but it takes the willingness to pull the card deck apart. And I know when you have that pristine new card deck with no smudges or anything on it, it's hard to pull it apart and get it out of order. If you're willing to do that, and I will tell you, it does pay off, go ahead and take it apart and organize it behind tabs. Now, the way I did my tabs, as you notice here, is that I did it by sound. So you're going to see what I call sound bars, and I have the grapheme or the symbol in the middle of what sound is there. So all of the spellings that represent the sound A or A are going to be behind that tab. So that might be my AI card, my AY card, my A card, and so on. But any of those that are going to represent it, I put it there, and it goes all the way back. Then you're going to see that I have tabs for digraphs, R-controlled, syllable types, diphthongs, beginning suffixes, all of that. So the tabs go all the way back. And it's just a nice, easy way to, if I'm thinking of a sound, I can pull out the spelling really quickly. Now, another easy way to do it is by using trading card pages. And so this really is size dependent. So you'll have to try it out with the type of card deck that you have. But what I like to do is sometimes I'll have a notebook per group or per class or per student, or I might just organize them by concept, like all of my vowel teams are on one page, or all of my short vowel flags, my generalizations are on page, or all my consonants are on one page. And maybe I have multiple pages of each one so that I can flip to that tab, pull it out, and be able to assemble my card deck pretty quickly. And then another way that I like to store my card decks are with just hard case crayon cover boxes. And so it's a nice way to just plug your cards in, close it up. It's really durable. You can put a label on it if you want to. You can have different colors for different students, different colors for different groups or classrooms. And it just is a nice plastic hard case way to travel with all of those cards so that they don't get lost in your materials. Now, a go-to is just putting it in a zipper pocket. I do that as well, and I'll show you that in my teacher notebook. But these are three of my favorite ways to hold or organize all of my card decks. Now, a few tips when it comes to card deck is I buy multiple decks and I take them apart. And that way I'm never missing that TCH, or I'm never missing that soft G when I need it. Or if both groups are working on soft G or both students are working on it, I have it in place. So I buy multiple decks and I pull them apart and organize them like I demonstrated. And that way I have them ready to go. Now, another way you could do it is to have a deck for each student. And so I love to color code. So a lot of when I did that system in this way, I had one student last summer who was all orange. Everything was orange for him. His notebook, his pencil pouch, his folders, all of it were orange. And so even his card deck case was orange. And so everything was color coded in that way. But maybe you have a deck for each group or each student. And that's always helpful too, because then you have the materials you need ready to go. Now, another way that you can do it is a digital deck. Now, I will admit I'm not super techie, but I have figured out how to do a digital deck. And as I'm working with classrooms and schools and as I'm mentoring them, one of the things that I like to do is I build a deck for them on Google Slides. And then they share it between each other. And then as they're doing their group planning, they can make a copy of the deck, move the slides around as they want, but all of the phonograms and concept cards they need are in that one deck, but they can move them around and organize them as they need for that particular lesson or for that particular week. So if you've never tried a Google Drives or a Google Slides deck, you might want to consider it, especially if you're working in a team or especially if you have multiple students, because you could build one master deck and then make a copy for each student. And then I have had practitioners who do it on the iPad, almost like visual cards where the student is looking at the iPad and the practitioner is swiping as the student is doing it, just like if I was holding up a card. Or I have had practitioners in classrooms who put it up on the smart board. And then that way the students are looking at a big version of the deck and they're able to do it successfully that way. So those are just a few tips on the card deck itself. Now, a part of the card deck is moving into my teacher notebook or the book of plans, all of my good plans for the week or for my student individually or for my groups or for my classroom. And as you can see in the picture here, I've done it a couple of ways. I have done it where each group or each student has that color-coded notebook that I mentioned before. And I put tabs in the notebook for each lesson I will have with that student for that week. And then I put a few extra tabs in there for when I'm gathering materials for future lessons. Or I have one notebook that has all of my small groups for the day. So that's my Monday notebook, my Tuesday notebook, and so on. But what I also do is even for my individual students, I build a teacher notebook, either one for each student, one for each group, and then one for my class if I needed to. I put pencil pouch at the beginning so that I have my card decks and any materials that I need. I have attempted to do a virtual notebook very similar to this. It's not been as successful, but it's something I'm working on. And I think if you were very organized in Google Drive, it's something that you could do. And then I also try to build notebooks for concepts, which we'll talk about in just a second. But I'd like to switch over to my document camera and give you a sneak peek into one of my notebooks. So here's one of my teacher notebooks. And if you're going to notice at the very front, I have a zipper pouch and it has my card deck. It has my irregular word deck that you can't see very well. It has my PA chips. It has my little trinkets and things that I use for blending exercises. It has my highlighters. It has my flare pens that are my favorite, but it's all handy. And each notebook, whether it's group or student, has that particular group's material. So their card deck, their irregular word deck, so it's ready to go. Then I have at the beginning, lots of copies of my PA mats, my alphabet arcs if I need them, various versions of my PA mats, and multiple copies if I am working in a group. And that way it's ready to go. Then you're going to see that I have my lesson materials. So this would be Mondays. And I put everything that I'm going to need in here for Monday. And then when I'm done with that Monday lesson, especially if I'm seeing students back to back, what I like to do is I like to take everything that happened in that lesson and I like to put it in the back folder. And so in my mind, I know it's done, I'm finished. And then when I'm done with my day and I have all of these folders finished, that one had a math page in it, but when I have all of these folders finished, then I can go back and look, here's my lesson plan with my diagnostic notes and all the student work. Here's all of my materials from that lesson. Here it is from the next group. Here it is from the next group. And that way that I know that lesson is complete. I know all my materials are there to go back and make my diagnostic prescriptive notes to plan my next lesson. And it helps me to be able to keep moving from student to student or from group to group. So my one tip and trick is to put your lesson materials in the front. And then once you're done, flip them over to the back. And that way you can move on to your next student, but know that everything's there when you need it to go plan your lesson. Now, parenting tip. I set my children's notebooks up like this, and this is based on a notebook system I learned during my training, for their homework folders to be like this. So they have one binder they take to their co-op classes, and what they do is they have one tab for each particular class. And if there's homework, the homework goes in the front, and then when they sit down to do their homework in the evenings, they complete it, and then they put it on the back side. Once it's on the back side, they hand me their notebook so I can glance over it just to make sure it's there, offer any suggestions, and then it's ready to turn in to their teacher when they go to their next co-op class. So it's just a quick tip for home, that the same way that we put our plans in, and once we're done, we can flip them to the back for review and reinforcement. We can do that with homework too. So I have worked with my children to remember, put your assignments in the front. Then when you sit down to do your homework, complete it and put it in the back. And that's a symbol to me and a signal to you that I'm done with that work. It's easy to find when you go to class the next time. It's also an easy reminder that if it's still in that front pocket, it's not done. So it's just a helpful way to organize you as a practitioner when you're completing lessons back to back, and just kind of a side tip for homework help for parents. So that's kind of a glimpse into my teacher notebook. Again, I have all my goodies in the front in a Ziploc bag if I'm not organizing in a sheet protector or anything. And then I have all my extra copies here, and then a tab either for multiple days per student or for multiple groups in a day. So let's switch back. Now, the same way that I kind of have a master set of my cards that I can easily pull to build my card deck for my students and for my lessons, I'm going to do that for concepts as well. Because I have the great privilege of working with our community, and there is a lot of great resources. There are a lot of great resources out there. So when I find something that I like for DGE or TCH or Soft C or Silent E or something like that, I want to save it for later. So I have done several attempts at this. I'm very traditional in the sense that I love a good notebook. I love a label maker. I love, flare pens and writing out my tabs. So if you want to go this route, I still have those notebooks too. I've kept them. I built a big 3-inch binder for level 1, what I consider my level 1 foundational skills, then the next level, and then my final level, and then my morphemes, and so on. But it is in order of concept. So the same way it looks here, like I have a tab for beginning suffixes, I have a tab for closed syllables. In the notebook, it's easier to do it in the order of your progression because Google Drive kind of wants to organize it for you. But you can kind of create a virtual concept notebook where anytime I find something good that I want to hold on to, or a story that I like, I'm going to take it and drop it into that folder. So when I'm planning lessons, I'm like, man, I really need that NG passage. I can go to the NG. Oh, look at that. It's a great new info sheet, great passage I can use to be able to support my students. If it's a Google Doc itself, you can make a copy, adjust it ever so slightly to be individualized for your student or group. And then you have 2 options. So I think this is a good idea to do it as well. I will also say one of the most rewarding experiences was working on a team at a school specifically for students with language-based learning differences. And I had a fantastic team, and what we did is we built a community drive, and we put all our tabs in for all the concepts we were going to teach in our first, second team. And anytime we made something, anytime we found something, we would drop it into those folders. So we had just an amazing, just so many options for the concepts that we were teaching. So if you're in a group, if you're in a classroom, consider doing that with your group as well, because it sure makes lesson planning a lot more streamlined. And we all are looking for the gift of time. We're all looking for those extra few minutes. And, we're all doing this together. So we're all, have our, our awareness and looking for those great options to be able to use. So this is an example. You'll see right here, this is an example of how I've organized it on my Google Drive. And then I have the pencil paper divider notebook system as well. A little bit antiquated, but still very effective. And I surely still use them and keep them around. Now, assessment notebooks. So what I do for an assessment notebook as a private dyslexia therapist is I first decide which assessments I'm going to give. Depending on where you're trained, depending on what your setting is, you probably have your own list of assessments, and there are going to be target areas that we want to make sure we cover. But after I decide what assessments I'm going to give for each skill and level, then as much as possible, there's going to be some that have kits that come with them specifically and that sort of thing. But as much as possible, I'm going to take those assessment materials and I'm going to make a master copy in the order that I want to present those materials. So if I want to start with a handwriting assessment, if I want to start with my word reading or my PA assessment or my spelling dictation or my reading passages, whatever order I want to put that assessment in, I copy it and I have one master set. And so then I have my one master set notebook that's on the shelf. What I've also done is I've gone ahead and made multiple copies of mini assessment notebooks. And that way, if I get a call for a student, I can go over to my shelf, I can pull off my assessment notebook, it's ready to go. I'm ready for my assessment session. It already has notebook paper in it or handwriting paper in it. It already has 2 sharpened pencils in it. It already has note cards if I need it in there. So those mini assessment notebooks are copies of my masters ready to pull off the shelf, ready to go, so that I am prepared whenever a student calls to wanting a session and wanting to start sessions with me. Because a lot of the time you spend is pulling together materials. And oftentimes it's a lot easier to sit down on a weekend and make, 4 copies of your master assessment, put it together, organize them in little 1-inch notebooks or 2-inch notebooks than it is if you get a call in the middle of the week saying, hey, I'd like to have my student assessed, and everything else is going on with life and family and work. It's hard to pull all those things and be, very organized with it. So take the time, take that master set, make a few copies, and then pull that out. As soon as I do a full assessment, I move it into my student notebook and then I rebuild that notebook so it's ready to go. I always have a pre-made assessment packet ready and on hand so that I'm ready whenever I get the call for a student. So decide what you're going to present or what you're going to assess. Put it in the order you would like it with some flexibility. Put in things like handwriting paper, notebook paper, sharpened pencils, tracking fingers if you're working with an early learner to kind of engage them and have them participate. And then make those multiple copies so you're ready to go. Now, moving into my student notebook, or what I like to call the book of knowledge, because we want to remind our students that they are growing in their knowledge and their skill set. And so it's always fun to build this book of knowledge to show them how much their brain is expanding and how much rich information they're learning. And also, I want them to see it as a resource, a working resource that we're going to refer back to. So I like to use 3-ring binders with the slip covers on the front, the plastic covers on the front, because as I'm working with early learners, I slide in a tracing mat on the front so they can trace. I do my PA pieces on the back so that it makes it nice and easy for them to do it that way. And it also makes a nice slant board because I'm a big advocate for handwriting, and a notebook makes a nice slant board for those students who need that support. In my book of knowledge, and again, this is where that structured flexibility comes in, I might include irregular words, handwriting practice, phonograms, new phonograms I introduce, spelling generalizations, morphemes, grammar and written expression, or oral reading. I might also include vocabulary, and there's different types of things. If my student is not working on it, if it's not developmentally appropriate, or if it's not a skill that they need, then I don't include it in my notebook. But for the most part, these are my general categories. I include their pencils, their highlighters, their PA chips you see here, their mini mirror. I don't go anywhere without a mini mirror so that they're looking at their mouth as they're saying those sounds. But I put a pencil pouch in the front of their notebook with all of their goodies in it. And then I also have an extra copy in my teacher notebook. So let's switch over and take a quick look at the inside of one of my notebooks. So in the front, I might have a PA mat for the student in case I don't have one, or just that it's one that they prefer and that they like. Then I'm going to have a section for irregular words where any of the irregular word activities or introductions we're doing are going to be put. Behind the next tab, I'm going to have handwriting practice depending on the student and what they're working on. Then I'm going to have any new phonograms, introductory pages that I introduce, or any work I do for introducing a particular phonogram, both in form and sound and symbol. Then I'm going to have syllable work. Anything I do to introduce a syllable type is going to be behind this, including combining and dividing. Then I'm going to have my spelling generalizations. So anything we have that has to do with spelling generalizations, we're going to do there. Then I'm going to have a tab for my morphemes. As you can tell, this particular student is working on a variety of things, both phonograms, spelling patterns, and morphemes. Then I have a section for grammar and writing. Then a section for vocabulary. Then for a section for our oral reading passages. And so that's just a glance into one of my students' notebooks, one of my students' book of knowledge. And I was going to show you one that's a little bit different, not much, but you're going to see how handwriting is a little more intentional. This student is just beginning with that. So you're going to notice the handwriting section is much thicker. And then you're going to have more of your beginning phonograms, your beginning syllable types, your beginning spelling generalizations. Your grammar and writing might be a little bit more simplistic, as with your vocabulary. And then your oral reading passage, because this student is probably likely going to be more involved with decodable passages, it's going to be a bit of a thicker section as well. So that's an example of my student notebook. And the reason I like doing it this way is because, number one, when my student has a question about, oh, I can't remember what that consonant LE syllable is, then I take them back to their book of knowledge. We look up the page with their own handwriting, and it empowers them that, hey, I remember doing this. I remember writing it. And so it really helps them connect with their prior knowledge. And it also makes a great working resource for when I'm working with families and when I sit down to talk with families, or when I need to go and attend a meeting with the family or provide documentation for the family. Now, what happens when that book of knowledge gets pretty thick? I'm going to shelf that one, and we're going to start a brand new one. And that way it's always on the shelf and always ready to go. So if they have a question, I'm going to pull it off. We're going to take a look at it. And then we can keep building that new one as well. So I had a student who walked away with 3 books of knowledge before they were done with their dyslexia therapy with me. And it was a really it was a thing of beauty to see how we moved from phonogram all the way into morphology and more of those advanced concepts. Number one, it's just, great perspective as a parent and as a dyslexia therapist to see the growth, but to really have a tangible record of it is really something exciting. And it's exciting for the student too, because they get to see all of their hard work. So in my notebook sections, I have my irregular words. And so if I'm not doing an irregular word card reading or folder or notebook, I can put it in there. It could be recently learned words, or it could be all of them, just depending on how much space you have. For handwriting, if the student is working on handwriting, I keep the form introductory pages handy, because if they hesitate, I can pull out their book of knowledge and they can trace right over it and get that review and reinforcement of the form they're working on. Phonograms, any new phonogram pages, introductory pages, I put in there so that, and I put the most recent one on top. So it goes from most recent to oldest in the order behind the tab. Spelling generalizations, those are always ones, and they're great to have handy because they're the ones they usually have questions on. So if they can't remember when to use C or K and can't remember that cat kite rule, then I'm going to pull that book of knowledge out and we're going to review and reinforce and look at it. My morpheme book, so I'm going to make sure that I have my morphemes in there, the same thing for my grammar and written expression, and then my oral reading passage. And I'm going to show you the difference here in a bit of when I do a folder versus the notebook and how we can be different in that way. Now, some other notebooks that I might include or that I might build with my students over my time with them, or even in my work with my own children at home, is we build a homophone notebook. And what I love about building a homophone notebook is it's really helpful when we start doing vowel team instruction, because a lot of times we have to rely on that meaning piece to help us remember which spelling of the word to use. And so that might be another notebook that I build with my students as it's appropriate. If you don't want to put the vocabulary section in your book of knowledge, you could have a separate vocabulary notebook, and you could put it in alphabetical order. And so it's easy for them to look it up and practice those alphabetizing skills. And so that's another one that I might have if I don't want that as a section in my book of knowledge. Again, there's that flexibility. And then a handwriting family notebook, a stroke notebook, which I'll talk about in just a second. I do have a separate notebook for those because I use it specifically for introductions and I use it specifically for review. But then I also, for my individual students, have the ones that they have learned because I embed that handwriting into my introduction. So if they're working on handwriting and they're learning the sound and symbol for F, the F spells and they're learning how to form it, I have that handwriting form and connect it to that introduction. So they do have their own copy in their book of knowledge as well. But I will show you the handwriting notebooks here in just a second. But as you can see, having those family notebooks really makes instruction easier to implement and it makes review easier to include in your daily work. And we're always looking for ways to make our time more efficient, make our materials more organized so that we can keep the lesson moving and students engaged. So what about irregular words? And so we want to make sure that our irregular word practice is intentional and that it's often. And so there's a couple of ways that I organize my irregular words. And again, really, which system do I prefer? I don't really have a preference between the three. I use them all for different purposes. I use them all for varying students. And so hopefully with these suggestions, you can decide what best fits your own children, your classroom setting, your students that you're working with individually or in small groups. But I just want to give you a few options so that you can think about ways that you can have these materials ready to go to, review such an important topic. So the first thing is a folder or notebook. Now I tend to prefer, like I said, I'm a color coder. I tend to use the red because red means stop. I need to stop and pay attention to these words. There's something about them that are unexpected. So I'm going to pay attention to them. I like to put them in a red notebook or a red folder. I would only put in the ones that my student has learned. I'm not going to have anything in there that's new because I don't want them practicing incorrectly because practice makes permanent. So however they're practicing it is how they're going to map that word initially. So I want to make sure that they're practicing and mapping it correctly. Another thing that I like to do is I like to build a review ring. So after I've done an introduction, I have them put it on a review ring and each student gets their own with their own words. As you can see in the picture, I have them color code the unexpected part so that anytime they read it or trace over it to spell, that word analysis is present and there, and they can remember it, why it is, an irregular word, considered an irregular word. And so each student has their own ring that they work on. And then another way that I like to organize it is I like to put them in photo albums like so. And so what I'll do is I'll put them in groups. So like if I had would and should there together, I have some of my most common ones here at the beginning. But if my students are reading in print, writing in cursive, I do the print on the top for reading and the cursive on the bottom for tracing. If they're not doing cursive, then I would just have it this way and they would practice reading and then they would have practice that simultaneous oral spelling where they're naming the letter and spelling and tracing over it in this way. But each student would have their own little, $1.25 photo album. I print out my cards or write my cards on sticky notes so that they have what they need and they're ready to go with their review and practice. So those are 3 ways that I like to organize my student materials for irregular words. If I'm working at home with my own children, I take the words they're working on in class, or I put them in the words that I know that I've taught them, and I put them in order. I group them together by pattern or irregularity, and we practice these, and they travel with us when we need to, and it just makes a nice, quick, tangible review. And also, if you give a kid a photo album with a little dry erase marker stuck in the top, or if you laminate these cards and have a dry erase marker, there are very few kids that I have worked with that don't love any opportunity to use a dry erase marker. And of course, we have a blank page in the photo album and a blank page on the back of the card so they can doodle a little bit too. Now, some suggestions or routines for irregular words. For one-on-one, I build individual notebooks or rings based on my informal assessment of the student and based on my progress monitoring of the student. So when you see like a card like this, If I just do it on an index card, I check it off 3 times. I have taken it a step further and build a card set. But what I do is the 3 means they've read it 3 times in a row, 3 lessons in a row successfully. They have traced over it and spelled it 3 times successfully in a row if I'm working on spelling. But if they miss it in their sentence dictation, if they miss it in reading, then I pull it back into their individual ring and we go through the 3 again and practice it till we are just sure that we've rewired that mistake. So I build their notebook or their ring based on the individual. Now, let's say you're in a classroom and you need to do it with a small group. So I might use my irregular word progression, and I would try to individualize as much as possible. I do a lot of work with schools, and so they often have mandated lists. Like, this is the list that first grade has to work on, second grade has to work on, and so on. So if that's the case, what I do is I have gone in with them and I've looked at their list, and we have categorized and organized those words based on common irregularity, based on pattern, based on some morphemic piece, and so that we teach them in intentional groups. And then we deal with the others that are truly irregular and don't have something that we can connect with. So if you have a mandated list, I build it that way. I've done slide decks on the smartboard. I've done notebooks that are organized in a specific way. And I kind of tackle that mandated grade level word list. And then as much as possible, I would go through and differentiate with students in folders or word rings. But there's ways to address the whole group, the small group, and the one-on-one so that we can be as individualized as possible, with the understanding that sometimes our setting kind of, controls a lot of our instructional decisions. So I kind of got a little bit ahead of myself, but suggestions for instruction are when I introduce my irregular words, I'm going to introduce it in my warm-up if my students have that routine down where I can introduce it and do some, thorough word analysis and looking at the parts that play fair and don't play fair. If it's a student who just needs kind of a quick mini lesson of the word and the parts that are unexpected in the spelling or in the pronunciation, I'm going to do it there. But then once they're established, I'm reviewing and reinforcing. And the review and reinforcement piece is so important. And it's often what's left out. Like, we teach it and then we shelf it. And we don't want to do that. We want to give them repetitive practice with both reading and spelling as appropriate for the student. And by putting them in these photo albums, by putting them in folders, by putting them in rings, having the students be an active part of that. As you can see in the picture, I often will have my students make their own just on index cards and have them color code. That is really where the power is going to be, that they're getting that multiple attempts at reading and spelling and that repetition and that review and reinforcement. So being organized will help us spend more time on the important stuff, which is the reading and the review and the reinforcement and the spelling, rather than trying to find the cards or not knowing where to put the cards and that sort of thing. So handwriting notebooks. So like I said, I'm a huge advocate for handwriting. It's important that you embed your handwriting instruction into your literacy lessons. But when you just need that targeted review and you just need that targeted practice, then this is one way to do it. So I build lowercase form notebooks, uppercase form notebooks, and number formation form notebooks. And yes, I am a literacy teacher who directly and explicitly teaches number formation. That could come from my background being a classroom teacher. It could come from my background being a multisensory math teacher, but number formation is equally as important, and it is a direct and explicit part of handwriting. And so I teach my lowercase, I teach my uppercase, I teach my number formations, and I want to make sure to give them plenty of practice. So when we think about the research for handwriting, around 15 minutes a day when we're introducing them with direct and explicit instruction on those forms is what we need to get started. After that, to maintain it, we need about 5 minutes a day to maintain those forms. And then once we have got it to the point where we're kind of in maintenance, then we can do handwriting tune-ups as we move on. Now, one easy way to do that, especially in a classroom, is to have these notebooks ready so that you can pull them out. Again, the student can use a dry erase marker to practice those forms. There's only going to be the ones in there that you've taught as a class or that they know as a class. Once you get the notebooks made, like a class set of 6, a class set of 5, or even if you have this notebook built at home for your student to be practicing at home, Once you have it made, that's the hard part. So it's a little front loading with the planning and the organization, but then once you do, then you can pull those out and it's just a resource that you can use over and over and over again. So I wanted to give you a little insight or quick view into one of my handwriting notebooks. So I'm going to switch over to my dot camera here. And what you're going to notice is that I have them in order by family. So I have my tall line, midline letters, 2 o'clock letters, slanting letters, and other letters. But then I also have this tab for current practice. And so this first tab, anything that's in front of this first tab is current practice. So this tells my students, these are the ones that I need to focus on first. And so if you need to have all of the letters in one notebook just for ease of organization and distribution in your classroom, then what I would do is I would definitely have one of these current practice tabs. And what I would tell my students is all of the letters behind these tabs are letters we're going to learn, but we don't want to practice anything incorrectly because that sends the wrong message to our brain and we map it wrong. We don't want that. We don't have to practice. We don't want to have to unlearn it and learn it again. So if it's easier for you to have them all in one notebook and not add them one at a time, then I would have a current practice tab. And they would know that anything that's in front of this current practice tab is fair game. They can practice that. This makes a great first work activity. This makes a great at-home activity. This makes a great warm-up activity if you're doing an OG lesson, a small group OG lesson. And so being able to have whatever handwriting forms you're using, whatever practice pages you're using, it's nice to have them built and ready to go in the families, in teaching them stroke families that motor memory has already started because the strokes are very similar. And there's a whole lot of research and, not to get too far off on another passion of mine, but it's there. And so it's just an easy way to organize and implement. So I sort of already touched on this, but our direct instruction, it's nice to have those, direct routes of introducing the handwriting form. Once that's done, that's what I put in their student notebook. Those daily practice opportunities lend themselves nicely to doing it in the handwriting notebook. I've also, again, not to keep harping on a photo album, but I've also taken those handwriting pieces and put them in a photo album for practice that way. And then those tune-ups, pull out a handwriting notebook, pull out a handwriting photo album, pull out a card for them to trace over, just so they get that immediate direct feedback on how to accurately form that letter, just so that our handwriting continues to be improved. And again, by having these materials made, when that error happens, when that, oh, I need to send that home for homework happens, or, oh, I need a literacy center at my fingertips, it's already there. It's already made. It's an intentional center. It's an intentional practice activity. It's an intentional homework assignment, and it's ready to go. Now, suggestions for instruction when introducing those forms, embed it into your new learning. After that, you can use it in the warm-up portion of your lesson, and you can use any of these materials that we talked about. And then once established, use these materials for that intentional practice. Now, other things that I like to have in my classroom are visuals, because if you haven't noticed already, I tend to talk a lot. Brevity is not my gift. And so what I like to do is, in order to keep myself from talking too much in a lesson and interrupting those channels of learning for my students, anything I can do to minimize my feedback, and unless it's absolutely necessary, I want to do. Also, because we know that we have students who struggle with focus and managing their attentional energy. So having things like a lesson checklist, one, helps them see that they're making progress. So it's emotionally sound in that way. It also kind of helps them see kind of the light at the end of the tunnel, like I've only got 3 more things to do. It also lets them see if they kind of check out, it shows them where they're headed. So that's an important thing to do. And it really just gives them a sense of accomplishment that, oh, I've done the handwriting piece. I've done my visual drill. I've done my auditory drill. Check it off. And so that's one thing that I like to have, are lesson visuals or lesson checklists, because I think that's really important. I like to have brain break choice cards, because I think when I observe practicums, when I observe classrooms, one of the areas where we lose a lot of time is in brain breaks. I absolutely think they're necessary. I absolutely think you should have more than one in your lesson. But what often happens is, because there's too many choices, we get lost in the choices and the student can't move on or can't come back to the lesson. And so it interrupts our flow and interrupts our thinking. So what I like to do is I give them brain break cards. I give them 3 at the beginning of the lesson. I let them choose 3. I give them, so many minutes to choose, a minute or 2 to choose, and then we lay those 3 out. And after they have chosen those 3, then on the first one, okay, pick from the 3. Got it. This is the one. Okay, that goes back in the pile. Brain break 2. All right, you have 2 left. Which one do you pick? Great. Do that brain break. It goes back in the pile. And then the third one is already decided. So it gives them choice. It keeps you organized, and it keeps the lesson moving because they've had a part of selecting what they want, but then they have a part of selecting it when it's time for the brain break. But then it also kind of limits the choices so it's not too much. So it keeps your lesson organized and keeps it moving. And then the third suggestion I would have is lesson visuals. So even if you write this on an index card, even if you write it on the board, even if you write it on a sticky note, having something of reminders like your procedures. I want you to echo, tap, and write, or use your BD strategy, your bed strategy, if you're not familiar with that. Anything you can do to minimize your verbal feedback and let them concentrate on what they're doing, but point to that visual or hold up your hands. Anything you can do to be organized and efficient so that the student can maintain their focus and maintain their attentional energy on the task at hand is just going to be that much more helpful. Now, this is another example of a lesson visual, and I put this up on my wall because I have students, and this would have been second grade me if you'd had me, little me, kindergarten, first, second grade me in your class. I needed to move. And so this is a great way to do that. I put up my lesson schedule. I like lightning bolts because I want them to know that we are making brain connections. There is lightning striking in your brain. You are learning new things. You're making connections. And so every time you do one of these activities, we're doing it with purpose. And we're doing it because we're learning something new. And there's a reason we're doing it. And it's exciting. Because if you're excited, then they're going to be excited. And so anytime we do this, I usually get through 1 or 2, and then I ask a student to go over and turn the card to see our lightning bolt, so that we know that we've accomplished that task. Again, it's just one more way for them to see we're moving through the lesson, we're accomplishing things, we're coming up on a brain break, we're almost done, and it gives them a chance to get up out of their chair and take that quick break to flip it around and then come back to the table. So this is just another example of a lesson schedule that I might have. Now, how do I order my word work? And so word work can just be a list of words, but it also can be very engaging and on different platforms and different medias. And so I know you're going to think that I'm very obsessed with a photo album, but really it's just a really cost-effective tool for organizing all of these cards. And so I build sets of those. And so if I'm doing, if I need a student to review a particular concept for home learning, if my own child needs to work on a particular concept, if I need a literacy center, if I need a morning work activity, I have these organized and the student can go and pull it. They can practice their strategies of coding and dividing. They can read it. They can read it to a partner. They can read it for homework. They can read it to a parent. They can read it to my classroom assistant. They can read it to a volunteer, but it's just already pre-made and ready so that the review or the corrective feedback or the practice opportunity happens immediately. I'm not having to dig and find something. These are already made and they're ready to go. Same thing with sheet protectors. I have notebooks built in that same way. Same thing with picture sleeves. So I have a bunch of cards or an index card if you write on them that fit nicely into a 4x6 photo sleeve. And it's just a nice, easy way. The dry erase marker. I love a dry erase marker. My students love a dry erase marker. It's an easy way to have these concept notebooks built for intentional practice and intentional review. It's great for home learning, for practice for your student, but it's also great for a literacy center. It's an easy to implement literacy center, and it lasts year to year. Now, one of the last pieces we're going to talk about is the oral reading. And so, especially if you're in a classroom and you have different levels of reading that you're working on, as far as some are on decodable, some are on partially controlled, some are on authentic. If you have a group that's working on the same passage, if you have a limited access to copies and you can't copy a bunch of decodable passages, then hopefully here are a couple of suggestions for your work at home, for your work one-on-one, for your work small group, and for your work classroom. So when I was in the classroom, I would make class sets of my decodable. And again, I didn't just read the decodable one time. I often read it multiple times during the week. And so putting them in these plastic pockets with one of those round hooks is a great way to do it, because I just pull them out, pull the dry erase marker out of the pocket, and then we do our coding and we do our reading. We can erase it. I could use it for a different group, and they're flat and nice and easy to transport. And so you could do a lot of different dry erase markers, different color coding with it. And they're ready to go, and they're easy to hang on the wall and hang them on a hook, or pull them out so that I have class sets. You can also color code them. So if one group is reading a passage that's in the black pocket, one group that's reading a passage in the pink pocket. And so it's also easy for you to visually scan, pull it out, and so you're ready to go. Another way that I do it, especially with my one-on-one students, is, as you saw in the Book of Knowledge, there's a whole section for my oral reading passages. And I put those back there, the most recent on top, because I may want my student to reread the passage. I might be reading it again the next day. We might just need a passage where, you know what, we just need a touch of review on, CH spells ch. So I'm going to pull that passage out. We're going to practice it in some connected text. We're going to get some nice review going. And so I'm going to put it there so that they have that set of passages that they've already done the word work on. They have dug in and done the decoding, and they're ready to reread for practice and to build that fluent, smooth reading. If the Book of Knowledge doesn't work, I often will build a decodable reading folder. And I just call it a reading folder, and I put any passage that they've read in there so that they have it as like a handy go-to. If they finish early, they can pull it out and be practicing over it. If I'm working one-on-one and I just need a quick review passage, we can pull it out and work on it. When I send it home, or when I'm working with my own children, I pull it out because I know this is something that they should, for the most part, be able to read on their own, because there might be a few irregular words in there we need to practice, but for the most part, these are passages that they've already practiced and they've already had, a chance to work the words and to analyze. And so this now should be working towards a reread and a smooth read. And so oftentimes, instead of putting them in the Book of Knowledge, I'll take all of those decodables and I'll build a folder from oldest to newest, so they have that go-to resource ready to go and ready to read with. Now, one of the reasons that I like to put it in their Book of Knowledge or the folder or the pockets is because I'm not just reading it one time. Like I said, that first time we're going through and decoding, we are using our decoding strategies. We are kind of doing kind of like our difficult read, our hard read, because it's a lot of work to pull through those words. But that second read, I'm going to go through, and as you can see here, I might be doing something like chunking. It's a real, professional academic terminology there, chunking. Really, it's a nice way of saying phrasing. I'm going to phrase the words in my sentence so that I can model for my learner, and I can have the student practice reading as they would speak it, or as closely to how they would speak it as possible. So that second read, they might go through and they might practice phrasing it, or they might practice finding the punctuation. And then even in an additional read, they might be finding the verbs in the story, or the most common word in the story. And there's lots of things. We want to get a lot of mileage out of one passage. And so that's oftentimes why having it in those easy to access resources and an organization, that it's nice to have, because it makes this easy. We can spend more time reading and digging into the content than we do trying to find the passage stuffed in a folder in the bottom of your book bag. So being organized gives us the gift of time, and we certainly want that. And then again, it gives us an opportunity to send it home, or to reread with my child, or I might work on it with my child, and then when dad gets home, he reads it again with them. So it gives them an opportunity to get those multiple rereads that we know are so important. It helps build confidence, and it helps build authenticity and fluency. So when we think about our teacher materials and our teacher space, organizing a teacher space really is often overlooked. And it's something that we don't want to overlook, because it really is critical for effective and efficient instruction, because it gives us, like I said earlier, the gift of time. We're not searching for something. We are not looking for something wadded up in the bottom of a shelf, or, lost in a notebook. It takes some front loading and some planning at the beginning, but when we have these systems in place, then it makes us, or gives us the opportunity to really focus on the instruction and the work with our students, whether that's our own children, one-on-one, small group, or classroom. And so I hope that you've had a few tips for organizing the plethora of materials that come with working with learners, that come with working in a classroom, small group, and in your OG lessons. And again, just encouraging you to find a system that works for you, but also be flexible in that system. I can't tell you how many times I've changed a system. That doesn't mean I throw out the old ones. I actually shelf them because likely I'm going to circle back and come to that one previously, or likely I'm going to have a student who, you know what, that might really work for that student and that family and communicating effectively with that family. So again, I hope that you've had some tips that would be helpful for you. Again, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel to reach out. Here's my contact information. But I hope that you've had some takeaways, and I wish you all the best in all of your educational settings.